Okay, continuation of this breedlove uh, assessment here according to the Spiegel article. I stand by all the public statements. I said this before, and basically the German government, so here we go. He says that NATO's strategy is to release clear, accurate, and timely information regarding ongoing events. He also wrote that an alliance based on the fundamental values of freedom and democracy, our response to propaganda cannot be more propaganda. It can only be the truth. The German government, meanwhile, is doing what it can to influence breedlove. Sources in Berlin say that the conversations to this end have taken place in recent weeks, but there are many at NATO headquarters in Brussels who are likewise concerned about Breedlove's statements. On Tuesday of last week, so this is just last week, this is in March 2015, Breedlove's public appearances were an official item on the agenda of the North Atlantic Council's weekly lunch meeting. Several ambassadors present criticized Breedlove and expressed their incredulity at some of the commander's statements. The government in Berlin is concerned that Breedlove's statements could harm the West's credibility. The West can't counter Russian propaganda with its own propaganda. Rather, it must use arguments that are worthy of a constitutional state. Berlin sources also say that it has become conspicuous that Breedlove's controversial statements are often made just as a step forward has been made in the difficult negotiations aimed at a political resolution. Berlin sources say that Germany should be able to depend on its allies to support its efforts at peace. German foreign policy experts are united in their view of Breedlove as a hawk. I would prefer that Breedlove's comments on political questions be intelligent and reserved, says Social Democrat parliamentarian Niels Annan. For example, instead, NATO in the past has always announced a new Russian offensive, just as, from our point of view, the time had come for cautious optimism. Annan, who has long specialized in foreign policy, has also been frequently dissatisfied with the information provided by NATO headquarters. We parliamentarians are often confused by information regarding alleged troop movements that were inconsistent with the information we had, he says. The pressure on Obama from the Republicans, this is totally Spiegel's interpretation, of course, but also from his own political camp, is intense. Should the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine not hold, it will likely be difficult to continue refusing Kiev's request for shipments of so-called defensive weapons. And that would represent a dramatic escalation of the crisis. Moscow has already begun issuing threats in anticipation of such deliveries. So the Spiegel now is calling these threats, when in actuality they are merely a defensive posture, in my view. Any weapons deliveries to Kiev will escalate the tensions and would unhinge European security, Nikolai Patrushev, secretary of Russia's National Security Council, told the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda on Wednesday. Although President Obama has decided for the time being to give European diplomacy a chance, hawks like Breedlove or Victoria Nuland are doing what they can to pave the way for weapons deliveries. Now, I want to note right here, that Victoria Nuland is part of Obama's State Department. He is the one who has chosen her for this position. But let's go on with this article. So, we can fight against the Europeans, fight against them rhetorically, Nuland said during a private meeting of American officials on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in the beginning of February. In reporting on the meeting later, the German tabloid Bild, always a warmonger and always has been, reported that Nuland referred to the Chancellor's earlier February trip to Moscow for talks with Putin as Merkel's Moscow stuff. No wonder then that people in Berlin have the impression that important power brokers in Washington are working against the Europeans. Berlin officials have noticed that following the visit of American politicians or military leaders in Kiev, Ukrainian officials are much more bellicose and optimistic about the Ukrainian military's ability to win the conflict on the battlefield. We then have to laboriously bring the Ukrainians back onto the course of negotiations, said one Berlin official. The article continues with the rather conspicuous subtitle of Nuland's Diplomacy. Nuland, who is seen as a possible Secretary of State should the Republicans win back the White House in next year's presidential election, is an important voice in U.S. policy concerning Ukraine and Russia. She has never sought to hide her emotional bond for Russia, even saying, "I love Russia." Her grandparents immigrated to the U.S. from Bessarabia, which belonged to the Russian Empire at the time. Nuland speaks Russian fluently. She's also very direct. She can be very keen and entertaining, but has been known to take on an undiplomatic tone. And it has not always been wrong to do so, says the Spiegel. Mykola Azarov, who was prime minister under toppled Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, recalls that Nuland basically blackmailed Yanukovych in order to prevent greater bloodshed in Kiev during the Maidan protests. No violence against protesters, or you will fall, Nuland told him, according to Azarov. She also said, he said, threatened tough economic and political sanctions against both Ukraine and the country's leaders. According to Azarov, Nuland said that were violence used against the protesters on Maidan Square, information about the money he and his cronies had taken out of the country would be made public. This is quite amusing coming from Nuland, of course, because the very cronies she's supporting now are equally corrupt, I might add. Nuland has also been open, at least internally, about her contempt for European weakness and is famous for having said, "Fuck the EU," during the initial days of the Ukraine crisis in February of 2014. Her husband is the neoconservative Robert Kagan, and is, after all, the originator of the idea that Americans are from Mars and Europeans, unwilling as they are to realize that true security depends on military power, are from Venus. When it comes to the goal of delivering weapons to Ukraine, Nuland and Breedlove work hand in hand. On the first day of the Munich Security Conference, the two gathered the U.S. delegation behind closed doors to discuss their strategy for breaking Europe's resistance to arming Ukraine. On the 7th floor of the Bayerischer Hof, the hotel at the heart of Munich, it was Nuland who began coaching. While talking to the Europeans this weekend, you need to make the case that Russia is putting in more and more offensive stuff while we want to help the Ukrainians defend against these systems, Nuland said. It is defensive in nature, although some of it has lethality. Breedlove complemented that with military details, saying that moderate weapons aid was inevitable. Otherwise, neither sanctions or diplomatic pressure would have any effect. If we can increase the costs for Russia on the battlefield, the other tools will become more effective, he said. And that is exactly what we should do here, he added. In Berlin, top politicians have always considered a common position vis-à-vis Russia as a necessary prerequisite for success in peace efforts. For the time being, that common front is still holding, this is what the Spiegel says, but the dispute is a fundamental one and hinges on the question of whether diplomacy can be successful without the threat of military action. Additionally, the transatlantic partners also have differing goals. Whereas the aim of the Franco-German initiative is to stabilize the situation in Ukraine, it is Russia that concerns hawks within the US administration. They want to drive back Moscow's influence in the region and destabilize Putin's power. For them, the dream outcome would be regime change in Moscow. And here it is, out in the open, on Der Spiegel. A massive troop training range is located in Yavozivsk in western Ukraine near the Polish border. During Soviet times, it served as the westernmost military district in the Soviet Union. Since 1998, though, it has been used for joint exercises by Ukrainian forces together with the United States and NATO. So this is the site where US soldiers want to train members of the Ukrainian National Guard for their future battle against the separatists. According to the Pentagon's plans, American officers would train the Ukrainians on how to use American artillery locating radar devices. At least that's what the US Army in Europe Commander Lieutenant General Hodges announced in January. The training was actually supposed to start at the beginning of March. Before it began, however, Obama temporarily put a hold on it in order to give the ceasefire agreement reached in Minsk a chance. Still, the Hawks remain confident that they will soon come a step closer to their goal. On Tuesday, Hodges said that during an appearance in Berlin that he expects the training will still begin at some point this month. You know, I think we need to realize here that this kind of adventurism based on American foreign policy objectives is a very, very dangerous game. Because based on that kind of interventionism that they have so far exhibited since, let's say, 9/11, and I would say much further back, but let's just say since 9/11, since September 11th, 2001. This kind of military interventionism has led to complete chaos in the Middle East. You know, this includes Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, it is a complete mess. Oh, and I forgot Libya. Libya, of course. This is also NATO interventionism. And then we ask ourselves why radical Islamist extremists are popping up all over the place. And you don't think this has anything to do with US foreign policy. I mean, I'm scratching my head here, literally. I mean, you have to really go way back to the Cold War during the 50s on how all this got started and who started funding the extremists in that part of the region. I don't think this kind of a confrontation, which is being built up in the Western press, do you think this is worth a global nuclear war? Because I don't. So take a little time out and consider, if you consider Russia as an adversary, then consider their position for just a moment before things go completely out of hand. Thanks for listening.